Right, so since Wednesday, particularly amongst the Tories, we've seen a significant ramping up of Islamophobic sentiment and accusations, and it's all designed to basically silence us all on the matter of Gaza. What we are seeing is a concerted effort, not just by the Tories incidentally, Labour as well, to have any show of support or solidarity for Palestine to be conflated with supporting Hamas. Completely racist to do as that is, but it's designed to shut us up again, weaponising racism once more, and they're doing it because it worked before. How many people still think the lifelong anti-racist Jeremy Corbyn is a raging anti-Semite still, after all? Muslims across this country, as well as anyone else supporting Gaza in the face of genocide, are being made out to be terrorist sympathisers, in effect, with the threat of the law being potentially brought to bear on us over it. It's cultural genocide being committed by the West, being committed by establishment figures, not just in the UK, but abroad as well. Yet these are the people who will call us criminals if we let them get away with it. Right, so the weaponisation of Islamophobia is what we're witnessing right now, yet again. Muslim people the country over will of course be extremely concerned about what they are hearing from our politicians by way of attacks on people, basically just for supporting Gaza. But of course those communities are the ones being pointed out. And one of the most prominent examples has been Deputy Chairman, or former Deputy Chairman of the Tory party, Lee Anderson, 30p Lee, the Leanderthal, living up to that moniker this time for sure, dragging his knuckles to the GB News studio for his second job of spreading vile hard-right nonsense to anyone daft enough to watch him. That said, I'm now going to ask you to watch a bit of him now, but all in the name of science, you understand.
I heard the comments earlier you was making about Suella. Some of the comments she made earlier this week, and I don't actually believe that these Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is they've got control of Khan and they've got control of London. And again, this stems with Khan. He's actually given our capital city away to his mates. We've got Starmer. Beware, because if you let Labour in through the back door, expect more of this and expect our cities to be taken over by these lunatics.
Right, so he doesn't believe that Islamists, well, we tend to call them Muslims actually, Lee, but I suppose calling them Islamists makes them sound a little bit more dangerous, a bit more militant rather than observers of just a certain religion. But he doesn't believe they've taken over the country, at least, but they have taken over London, which is just as bad and just as mad, because apparently they control London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Muslims controlling Muslims in power. Muslims pulling the strings behind the scenes, that they're the real ones in charge, in the shadows. He's given the capital away to his mates, according to Lee. So are the, well, let's call them the Muslim lobby, I suppose. Let's regard this mythical entity of Anderson's fevered mind in charge of Khan, or are they his mates then? Make your mind up. Beware Labour, these people are lunatics. Labour will let them take over. So finishing on an attack on his old party, Labour. Anderson used to work in the office of former Labour MP Gloria De Piero, in case you weren't aware. But this is, of course, blatant dog whistle Islamophobia and fear-mongering, weaponising Muslims as some sort of boogeymen against everyone else. And that will terrify people who live in those communities. People in them will be endangered by that sort of rhetoric, because we've seen it all happen before. We've seen attacks on them as a result of it. I'd also use the classic example of exposing the racism, because imagine the reaction if instead of Muslims, Anderson was talking about Jews here instead. He'd be accused of anti-Semitism before his feet touched the floor, and would almost certainly have been suspended from the Tory party by now for making such blatantly racist comments as those would be. But instead, Islamophobia is once again on show as less important, because Sunak hasn't budged an inch on such things. Anderson's comments came in light of a Tory Graph article he referenced, the Daily Telegraph, most loyal of those Tory papers, and notably and uncustomarily not hidden behind a paywall either. So a story, a narrative that paper's proprietors would clearly like spread as far as possible on this occasion. And it was entitled, Suella Braverman, Islamists are in charge of Britain now. And she claims this is happening because of what happened at the SNP Gaza ceasefire motion on the opposition day just on last Wednesday. Here's an excerpt from that which is relevant. Mrs. Braverman, who was sacked by Mr. Sunak after she accused police of playing favourites with pro-Palestinian protesters, accused Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, of being in hock to extremists and taking the Speaker hostage with a grubby backroom deal over the Labour amendment. The truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now, she wrote. They have bullied the Labour Party. They have bullied our institutions, and now they have bullied our country into submission. The former Home Secretary accused political leaders of burying their heads in the sand, preferring to believe in the illusion of a successful multicultural society, and remaining terrified of being called racist if they challenged them. But the law has not changed. Mass extremism parades itself proudly. Campuses remain dangerous places for Jews, and Labour is still rotten to the core. She's as utterly unhinged as ever she was. A multicultural country she's very much part of, and she's very much benefited from. But clearly the Tories can see advantage in making out that Labour are being controlled by extreme Islamist factions of some description. They put down an amendment to the SNP's ceasefire motion, but it was as much about neutering it for the Israel lobby as Labour's was. Labour just couldn't be seen to yet again be agreeing with the Tories on something like this. Now, if you watched my video from yesterday, which covered now deleted footage aired by Sky News, why did you delete that, Sky News? Where Starmer revealed he had come to his ceasefire amendment after having spoken to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. It's a pretty hard reach to think Starmer is beholden to Muslim influence when it's been pretty obvious, and this kind of dotted the I's and crossed the T's on it, that Starmer owes everything to the Israel lobby, and it very much now looks like he could be taking direct instruction from them. So why do the Tories not point that out? Well, that would blow the anti-Semitism scam they helped perpetrate right out of the water. They can't criticise Israeli influence because they conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And if they roll back on that now, all that business concerning a certain former Labour leader, one Jeremy Bernard Corbyn, would be far more widely exposed. Not least his attempts at negotiating with Hamas, for instance, those references to being his friends, which should be seen in a different and far more honest light these days, as they should be. Instead, the Tories are now seeking advantage by accusing Starmer and co. of leaning on the Speaker, which he probably did, but as part of some Muslim plot. And it's Hoyle himself who opened the door to that, with his excuses after the fallout on Wednesday, claiming some terrorist element was coming for MPs, and that's why he allowed Labour's amendment. Before the debate, he said he was suspending Standing Order 31 without a vote to do so because it was outdated. He weaponised some kind of terrorist plot to save his own backside, is how it looks now. We have no more proof of this plot than his words. And because of that, he's given the Tories an attack on Labour using Islamophobia as a club, which is shameless and depraved, and with Suella Braverman proudly saying it parades itself proudly. And in doing so, she is in no uncertain terms dragging the pro-Gaza ceasefire demonstrations that we see every single weekend, quite rightfully so, into this web of deceit too, accusing anyone taking part in those marches of being part of a baying hate mob trying to take over our country. Instead of just standing up for people on the receiving end of genocide, being blown to bits by a country which actually has far too much influence in our political class, who we're still supplying arms to, and stand accused of aiding and abetting in that genocide. But no, those of us who speak out against, march and protest against that, we're the problem, according to her. She's amongst the most cruel, self-serving, deranged politicians we have today, and shame on the people of Fareham and Waterlooville if she's still an MP after the next election. I could add in Liz Truss at this point. She was standing with the far right in the US this week, you might have seen that, claiming conservatism is endangered in the UK. More's the pity it isn't, but again she stoked anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to do so. Frankly, the less said about Truss the better, though. She actually believes she was forced out as part of an agenda rather than the fact she crashed the economy. The tractor Tories of Norfolk that keep electing her have a lot to answer for. She was outlasted by a lettuce guy's "you didn't grow her." There was also Robert Jenrick, Honest Bob, so called because he's anything but who said that Britain has allowed our streets to be dominated by Islamist extremists. In all seriousness, though, this is such a dangerous time for British politics, and it's going to endanger people in Muslim communities up and down the country. The same people that hammered Corbyn over racism are the same people giving Truss and Anderson and Braverman a free pass on the bile they are spilling, and that's why this is so rampantly Islamophobic. It was Hoyle and Starmer that opened the door to this to stymie an SNP motion calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza because they're in hock to the Israel lobby. MPs today are in no more danger from a Muslim terrorist attack today than they were last Tuesday or last week, because this is weaponization of Islamophobia to get both Starmer and Speaker off the hook. This is Islamophobia that is completely out of control, not Muslim influence, but being propagated right now by our parliamentarians, media editors such as those of the Telegraph, and their journalists. and other journalists as well who have made disparaging comments from other publications as well. During World War II, we know Jews were ostracised, amongst other demographics of course, and before then too, stick with me, viewed as outsiders lurking within an acceptable establishment midst. And we know how that ended up, we know how that went. Now we're seeing it happen again with Muslims, and all for what? Political capital and to excuse Israeli genocide. If you're going to make these claims, especially in Parliament, claiming you're protecting MPs by bending the rules, let's see the evidence of it. I'm not going to take Hoyle's word for a damn thing, not when he hasn't been able to get his story straight. Peter Oborne, a former Conservative voter no less, who writes for Middle East Eye these days, wrote on this matter of evidence. No evidence has been provided. No evidence from the Speaker, who set the media storm in motion. Nothing from Starmer, who briefed him. Remember that physical and verbal intimidation are crimes. That includes common assault and even the use of threatening language, including online. Anyone who physically threatens an MP or any other politician can and must be prosecuted. If such threats have been made, as Starmer and Speaker Hoyle claim, then charges must follow, and then jail sentences. Thus far, such claims are not standing up. He's absolutely right. The excuses of Lindsay Hoyle have set in motion an appalling attack on Muslims and support for Gaza, which could even encourage further legislation to clamp down on these, such as the fact both main opposition and government are completely at odds with the general public on this matter, on the matter of a ceasefire. It's dangerous, and all these politicians should be justifiably condemned. And if you watch this video recommendation here up next, I detail how Hoyle's excuses have come unravelled. Not that this is being pointed out by the mainstream media at all. It shows where all this Islamophobic sentiment is now coming from, what he's done that has triggered this. That should make him even more unfit to remain in post as House of Commons Speaker. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the business of Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, allowing motions from both the government and Starmer's Labour Party on SNP Opposition Day, well, the fallout from that is rumbling on still, and does so pretty much because Hoyle is still putting party politics before the needs of Palestine. If you've watched my other related videos on this story of our Parliament pretty much collapsing into a farce of politicians falling all over each other to prove who is the most pro-Israel, you'll know that after Hoyle apologised for bending the rules and letting Labour's motion in against the Standing Order on Opposition Day motions, Standing Order 31, bending the rules, he promised to make it up to the SNP by invoking another Standing Order, Standing Order 24, to grant them an emergency motion on Gaza. But not liking that either, he's broken his word again, and he's now binned that. The calls for Hoyle to go will get ever stronger. More and more MPs are signing an early day motion demanding he resign, 77 at time of writing. But even if he did, his likely successor would potentially be even worse. Right, so Hoyle has done it again. After sidelining a standing order without taking a vote to legitimately do so, he's literally done it again. A different standing order this time, but it is the SNP and Palestine who were told again that it's their voices in Westminster that do not matter. You see, the SNP wanted to bring forward a meaningful vote, a Brexit-inspired move, which would be an advisory vote unless Hoyle made it otherwise, but would also be unamendable. And when the purpose of the SNP's motion on Gaza had been to not only highlight the plight of tens of thousands of innocent Gazans trapped with nowhere to go, when tens of thousands of them have already been killed, but also to expose and shame the other two main parties for not supporting Gaza already and not censoring Israel already, as we know they would do. Both main parties very much influenced by the Israel lobby as they are, with some 3/5 of Labour's front benchers having been taking donations from the Israel lobby and about a third of Tories. If they just did the right thing, they'd have nothing to worry about, of course, but they can't afford to. The donations and maybe any dirt the lobby has on them would be at stake if they did, such as how these parties and how they are run have been compromised. The SNP meaningful vote, however, also this time was demanding an end to arming Israel and that the UK must use its voice at the United Nations to act accordingly. No more sitting on your hands at the Security Council and abstaining whilst the US continues to veto a ceasefire, for example, is how I read that. Well, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn yesterday asked Hoyle why this SO24 emergency motion that Hoyle had offered them had not been accepted, and when it will be. And this is what Hoyle waffled in response.
Can I first of all say, How grateful I am to the honourable gentleman for giving notice of his point of order. The standing order says that I should not give the reasons for any decision regarding an SO24 application. Indeed, properly, we should not be discussing it when it's a private application of the Speaker. However, given the exceptional circumstance we find ourselves in today, my view is that I ought to nonetheless explain my reasoning. In determining whether a matter is proper to be discussed under standing order, I must have regards to two criteria. Firstly, the extent to which it concerns the administrative responsibilities of ministers of the Crown or could come within the scope of the ministerial action. I am satisfied that that matter does not relate to the areas of ministerial responsibility and falls within the scope of the ministerial action. Secondly, in determining whether a matter is urgent, I must have regard to the probability of the matter being brought before the House in time by other means. The House came to a resolution on this matter on Wednesday last week. Further, I understand the government. I further understand the government is ready to make a relevant statement tomorrow, so there is a very imminent opportunity for this matter to come before.
So basically, Hoyle brought up the two criteria by which he measures emergency motions as a reason to refuse the offer that he'd made to the SNP to refuse their meaningful vote, to refuse their new motion. Basically, it has to be a relevant order of business for ministers to consider, because a resolution was passed on the matter last week, and on top of that, the government are bringing a statement to the Commons today, still to happen at time of writing on this matter. So basically, after bending the rules before to let in a Labour amendment that caused all the problems last week, they saw that Labour amendment pass unopposed because the Tories and the SNP stormed out of the Commons, Hoyle is now resolutely standing by the rules on this occasion to again refuse the SNP. I really don't know how much bigger a message can be sent that the voice of the SNP and the voice of Scotland don't matter. But equally, everyone's standing up for Palestine. Your voice doesn't matter. For Gaza right now, your voice doesn't matter. Your opinions, your views aren't being heard either because they don't matter. And the rules will be bent to suit pro-Israeli interests because that is what we have seen happen already. I mentioned how in hoc to the Israel lobby both Labour and the Tories are a moment ago. But equally so is Hoyle, who, as I've mentioned in other videos, went to Israel last November to see the evidence of the Hamas attack, but how much was legitimately Hamas and not the IDF or Shin Bet, the Israeli forces, is another matter, one yet to be determined because the accusations against them are there, but also that Hoyle's father was a founder of Labour Friends of Israel. So the level of complicity and level of being compromised is off the charts on the face of things here. Now, some might point to the additions of the SNP meaningful vote as part of the reason they got refused. They've added in an arms embargo on Israel, an immediate end to the genocide, declaration that Israel are guilty of war crimes. But Hoyle didn't mention those. He hid himself behind the rule book to suit himself, having binned the rule book last week, also to suit himself. What did Starmer say to you, Hoyle? We do need to know. And so, of course, the calls for Hoyle to go continue this week. His position was already untenable. He'd abused the trust and the faith of the House, and every MP sat in it had in him to remain impartial. And he's just gone and done it again. But if you do replace him, who's going to take over? Well, the one name being heavily touted right now is someone who cropped up in my last video on this matter. The Labour MP for Rhondda, Chris Bryant. Bryant is a somewhat familiar face on the telly. He's regularly showing up for interviews on the news or the politics programmes. He's a former priest. He's a former Tory. So very much on the Labour right, very much Starmer's sort, and also very much implicated in this matter. Now, if you saw my last video, I covered a new eyewitness account to what went on between Keir Starmer and Lindsay Hoyle in his chambers that led to Hoyle's shift on allowing Labour's amendment, which under Standing Order 31 should not have been permitted. Starmer convinced him somehow to bin that standing order without taking a vote on it. Threatened is the allegation, hence Starmer's referral to the Privileges Committee, Standards Committee. Now, this account of what happened came from the Sunday Times, Murdoch paper, so I said very much take it with a large pinch of salt. However, one of the allegations that account made was that Labour whip Chris Elmore told Labour MPs to use every procedural device available to them to hold matters up while Starmer spoke to Hoyle, threatened Hoyle, convinced Hoyle. Bryant, it was alleged in that report, called a vote during the 10-minute rule bill to hold matters up further. A filibuster. He'd already spoken for 7 minutes, so he was in the rules of the 10-minute rule bill where everyone gets 10 minutes to speak on it, but he called a vote. That's the filibuster. And Chris Bryant has been asked about this since.
The way we do our business in Parliament is terrible. I mean, we brought ourselves terribly into disrepute, I think, on Wednesday.
But were you put up to that filibuster, or did you take it upon yourself?
A bit of both, if I'm honest. I think the whole day was grubby, right. And we need a system which doesn't allow people to manipulate the rules to be able to get what they want.
Which you did. Yeah.
Chris Bryant has complained that that clip is selective. I rather think Cathy Newman asked 2 very short, very straight questions, and your answers were very short and very telling. It also bears out that Times article all the more. You literally sat there and called it a grubby, appalling day that brought all of Parliament into disrepute, all of you MPs into disrepute. Well, that was the only honest thing you actually did say there. But you were part of that. You were, until not long ago, the chair of the Standards and Privileges Committee. My God, if you're adjudicating MP standards, no wonder things are in the state they are then, surely. Really reassuring that Starmer has been referred to it now, isn't it? At least Bryant's not there. But Bryant also wrote a book called Code of Conduct, Why We Need to Fix Parliament and How to Do It. Fix Parliament for who is what I'm thinking right now, and I'm sure many of you might be thinking the same. But if you need an idea of the sort of person this appeals to, centrist dad James O'Brien called it takes a bulldozer to the crumbling edifice of parliamentary standard, and somebody who knows a sexed up piece of trash when he sees it, former Blair spin Dr. Alistair Campbell, called it vital. It should serve as a wake-up call to all of it. Well, they might gush over it. I went on Amazon to look at some reviews for it, entertaining they can be at times, to see what some people have said. This one is typical of several on there who didn't much like Bryant's work. I had hoped that in Bryant's book I would find an intention to blow fresh air through the corridors of Westminster. Goodness knows, after the last 13 years it needs it, and the apparent willingness of MPs all levels simply to lie when convenient, let alone trash the UK economy in a single afternoon, suggests there is a day of reckoning to be had. Instead, Bryant, I think, is part of the problem, seeing little wrong with all that is going on at present, and his remedy is a few tweaks at the edges of a rotten, self-serving setup that requires root and branch change to serve the people of the UK. I thought he was one of the good guys, but he simply isn't. Perhaps what Bryant did last week needs to go down in the 2nd edition then. But this goes further, because if Hoyle goes, Bryant is one of the most likely replacements for him. In fact, he's the bookie's favourite to do so, with odds of 3-1 on him right now. But what possible additional trust can we have in Parliament with him as Speaker replacing Hoyle? Hoyle is done. He's damaged. There's no recovering from what he's done. I do believe he's on borrowed time. But Bryant instead? For one, he was runner-up to Hoyle last time. For another thing, he'd be completely distrusted from the start in light of his role in these matters over the last week. None of the deputy speakers inspire much confidence either. Parliament is in a state. The quality of politicians is dire. And when the Speaker has to come from amongst them, there shouldn't be any surprise that they are actually just as bad. Get the full details on that eyewitness account, which is beginning to look more and more plausible, more accurate, despite the source material, as my video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so once again, the Green Party trying to bin off appallingly bad legislation that is going woefully underreported in the House of Lords, because Labour once again side with the Tories over it. But when it is on matters concerning the NHS, Labour siding with the Tories should ring alarm bells in anyone's head. Yet this is what we have. Green Party peer Natalie Bennett attempted a fatal motion to try and kill off the Anaesthesia Associates and Physicians Associates Order of 2024, based on concerns that it represents a significant constitutional change without the necessary parliamentary oversight. Significant constitutional change is one way of putting it. Going to the doctor and not knowing if you're actually seeing a fully trained, experienced doctor or not is going to be the reality for many of us. That is terrifying and fundamentally will lead to those able to pay to see doctors and those who aren't on the NHS entering instead a healthcare lottery. Right, so in a move widely seen, at least in those circles even aware of this happening, because the mainstream media are typically silent on something that actually matters to us, as the two main parties join forces to strip us of the quality healthcare we all believe we're entitled to when we seek medical assistance free at point of use from our NHS. It is an attempt to block the blurring of the lines between fully qualified, trained and experienced doctors and so-called associate anaesthetists and associate physicians, AAs and PAs for short, and clearly by the terminology, not doctors. By placing these AAs and PAs under the oversight of the General Medical Council, though, the GMC, who have always only been a regulator of actual doctors, the concern is that people will not realise that these AAs and PAs are not actually real legitimate doctors at all. That confusion can come about as a result that people may not realise they are not seeing a doctor, but are instead seeing somebody fast-tracked into a doctor's role to fill the yawning gap of vacancies coming up in this country as we continue to not train enough doctors, as we lose more of them due to retirement, overwork, Brexit driving many foreign workers away and making our already fragile NHS buckle even more. The argument is that these are people who have got medical experience, that they have worked in and around doctors in supporting roles, possibly for years. And therefore this can be seen as, well, just another form of promotion, if you like. But years of experience doesn't replace qualification. You can have cabin crew, for example, with decades of experience on passenger aircraft, but you wouldn't let one fly the plane, would you? I used to work in ship repair. Do you know something that doesn't qualify me for? Captaining a bloody ship. Same difference here. Doctors Association UK, the DAUK, issued a statement saying they had urged Labour peers to back the Greens' fatal motion, which makes this all very clear. They wrote, "The Doctors Association UK, DAUK, is supporting a motion being laid before the House of Lords which aims to kill off plans for the regulation of non-doctors by the General Medical Council, GMC. Former Green Party leader Baroness Natalie Bennett is set to put down a fatal motion to throw out the draft Anaesthesia Associates and Physicians Associates Order 2024. DAUK has opposed GMC regulation of PAs and AAs and has called for a pause on their recruitment and rollout. The association has long-standing concerns that the legislation will blur the roles of doctors and non-doctors, creating a misunderstanding of the role of the PAs and presenting a significant risk to patient safety. It has written to Labour peers urging them to vote against the draft order." DAUK co-chair Dr Matt Neal said, "DAUK is strongly opposed to the Anaesthesia Associates and Physician Associates Order 2024 and welcomes the fatal motion being moved by Baroness Bennett. However, we're disappointed that Labour has not sought to back the position of putting patient safety first, given the very real concerns within the medical profession and amongst the public about non-doctors. There have been many reported instances of PAs operating beyond their competencies and being linked to patient harm. We need to pause the recruitment and rollout of PAs immediately until the scope of their roles is addressed by the GMC, the Royal Colleges and other stakeholders. The regulation of non-doctors and their rollout in the NHS is an issue of huge importance to the health of the nation, and we urge the Lords to oppose this legislation." DAUK this weekend reported the Royal Berkshire NHS Foundation Trust to the police over concerns around negligence leading up to a patient's death. It follows a report in the Sunday Telegraph that the family of celebrated film makeup artist Christopher Tucker had urged the coroner to investigate his death amidst concerns over his treatment by a PA. Meanwhile, a recent DAUK survey completed by more than 650 doctors highlighted significant worries about PAs operating beyond their competence and affecting the quality of medical training. Dr Neal said there is a need for a regulatory framework for PAs away from the GMC register for doctors, which includes guidelines, supervision, accountability and patient safety. Patient safety must be paramount, and we believe GMC regulating medical associate professions, MAPS, could compromise that. We'll continue to work with the BMA, GMC, the colleges and other stakeholders to make these roles safer. So did Labour peers listen in the end? No. In fact, there was so little support for Natalie Bennett's fatal motion that she ended up being forced to withdraw it after the debate, so it never even went to a vote. The excuses and the reasoning from various peers are as insulting as they are infuriating. Tory peer Lord Whoops I Lost My Phone Bethel said, "We have to find people from somewhere to do GP appointments, and there are going to be some people, physician associates, that don't necessarily go through the 10 years of qualification to become a GP." He also got rather confused at one point and called the AA's associate anaesthetists, thus demonstrating that he didn't really even know what he was talking about. He won't be troubled by that, though. He can afford to go private. Perhaps we need some Lords associates to do the job instead of peers like you. Here's a novel idea. How about we elect them as well at the same time? Just a thought. Labour peers were just as bad though. Pulse, the GP's magazine, covered this story, bringing up comments by Lord Hunt, with an excerpt from that magazine saying, arguing for the legislation, Lord Hunt of King's Heath, a Labour peer, criticised campaigners who list the errors made by PAs. He said, what would happen if we asked people to report mistakes made by F1 medics each August? The BMA is playing with fire in the campaign it has adopted by putting these poor professionals who are doing their best in this frame. I protest about this and the general lack of medical leadership from the profession when it should have been defending the associates. The way it has run away from this issue has been a disgrace. It will find that its lack of leadership and strength will bite it in future. That's a Labour peer attacking the doctors' trade union, the BMA. He also said that the government isn't bringing out PAs fast enough and that he wants to see more of them than the 10,000 so far promised. Other peers were arguing that they wanted to see a list of comparative errors between doctors and PAs, as if that isn't missing the point entirely and blurring the very lines that this entire opposition has been about. The very argument the Greens were making against this move. Would you like to blindfold the doctors to make it fairer and perhaps deliver the findings you want as well? Well, the BMA itself tweeted out afterwards. Extremely disappointing that peers have tonight waved through legislation that will blur the lines between PAs and doctors with potentially dangerous consequences for patients. We thank peers who urge government to heed the warnings of the medical profession. We won't have an NHS left with more of the Tories or an incoming Labour government led by Starmer, not when they are in a lockstep of not only introducing more privatisation into how the service is run, it might be free at point of use, but it will cost more and more to run to line those private investors' pockets, and all of that will be used as an excuse to claim it is becoming more and more unaffordable. It's all a lie, and this business with AAs and PAs is a cost-cutting exercise that will cost and cut lives. Our lives, not theirs though. If you need an NHS, what has become unaffordable for you is a vote for the Tories or Labour. I delved into more detail on the meaning of these fake doctors last month in this video recommendation here if you wish to learn more. If this story has come unawares to you, I'd humbly suggest watching it next. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's Labour, they got their way on their ceasefire amendment, didn't they? They convinced the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, to let their amendment stand, bidding off a standing order to do so. The SNP got shafted, firstly because it was their opposition day that Labour's amendment ended up hijacking, and later when the Speaker offered them an emergency motion to make up for it, they got shafted again when the Speaker refused to accept it. Democracy has been completely trashed, and Starmer even had the temerity to thank Hoyle on his way out of the chamber last week for his part in playing into Starmer's pro-Israel leanings. Labour's call for a ceasefire, of course, the only thing that actually passed last week, their amendment, stripped out accusations of war crimes against Israel, despite a plausible case for that being ruled on by the International Court of Justice. Blame for Hamas was slotted in, despite the fact they have stuck to previous ceasefires, and it is Gaza that is overwhelmingly on the receiving end right now of atrocity. So Labour's call for a ceasefire is a weak and quisling affair, and now by Labour's actions since, even that is proving to be completely dishonest too. Right, so as regular viewers will know, I've been covering the fallout and the aftermath of last week's botched opposition day called by the SNP, which functionally turned into a Labour opposition day when Speaker Lindsay Hoyle bent the rules to allow Starmer's Labour an amendment when normally they would not get one on such an opposition day. This has led to the SNP being screwed over not just that once, but twice now. A motion of no confidence in Hoyle has now been signed by 88 MPs, and trust in him maintaining order is in the bin amongst a great deal of the general public as well. How can he ever be trusted to be at the heart of our democracy after what he has done to help Starmer, help Israel, and deny elected representatives of the people of Scotland their voice, along with the voice of everyone across the country wanting to see Israel censured and a ceasefire for the people of Gaza? But this story isn't dying down, because if Starmer truly wanted a ceasefire, the actions of his party since don't match that one iota. Labour MP Harriet Harman appeared on Good Morning Britain this morning to discuss the threats MPs have apparently been receiving now, something very much weaponised by Speaker Hoyle to justify his rule bending, because he never mentioned such threats when he bent the rules, only bringing them up as part of his apology to the House of Commons afterwards. making it all very hard to believe. This is what Harman had to say on the matter of Labour not backing that SNP motion.
The SNP are proposing an immediate ceasefire. Why couldn't Labour just vote for that?
Because there were certain differences in our motions. Our motion wanted to absolutely condemn the terrorism and call for the hostage release. Their motion had condemning Israelis for what they describe as collective punishment.
The SNP proposed an immediate ceasefire. Why couldn't Labour support that? Because there were certain differences, like immediacy for one, like blaming Israel for their part, by acknowledging the ruling of the ICJ, by making it clear this is a genocidal war. It is not two sides equally committing atrocity. We're talking about a Hamas incursion on one night being revisited upon Gaza with 4 months of relentless, indiscriminate bombing from one end of the strip to the other, the surviving people with nowhere left to go, and tens of thousands of Gazans already dead, mostly women and children. That's what the SNP wanted an end to in actuality. That's what Labour couldn't bring itself to agree with. Collective punishment, my God, we've been witnessing it for social media for months. This genocide has been playing out in real time. For the first time in history, this has happened. And the arrogant dismissal of reality is infuriating, to say the very least. That's the net result of Starmer's motion succeeding, though. Nothing changes. It's all just words. Starmer, incidentally, for his part in convincing Hoyle to break the rules, has been referred to the Standards and Privileges Committee. Harman, unfortunately, is the chair of that committee. And you just know that if she's prepared to go on morning news rounds and shill like she did there, she'll do her damnedest to get Starmer off, though whether she's able to succeed in that obviously will remain to be seen. But even what Harman said Labour wanted there doesn't match reality, because as I said a moment ago, it is all just words, and nothing proves that more than Labour still suspending members, even councillors, as this case shows, all because they have called for a ceasefire still, which Labour in Parliament has done. We mustn't forget, they've actually voted for that now. Now, I've spoken of the suspension of Lambeth Labour councillor Martin Abrams previously, late last year, following that first ceasefire vote the SNP triggered last November. Abrams is Jewish. He's opposed to what Starmer has been doing and saying, and made claims that he was actively being deselected by Labour to stand again in Lambeth because of his pro-ceasefire stance. He spoke out on this at the time, saying, "There are strict diktats being issued from the very top of the party down which have created an ice-cold, chilling effect with the aim of silencing any and all debate on the current situation in Gaza and any support for the Palestinian people. I have been particularly outspoken on the horrors taking place in Palestine and Gaza and the Labour leadership's shocking refusal to call for an immediate ceasefire, and as a result there are now clear attempts to deselect me as a Labour Party councillor for my view." Wow. This week, following Starmer formally backing a ceasefire, though heavily caveated to let Israel off as much blame as possible, as their version of a ceasefire does, Abrams has not only been deselected, but suspended indefinitely from the Labour Party. And he wasn't alone in getting censured for opposing what Abrams has called one of the greatest crimes of our age, as 3 other Labour councillors earned themselves suspensions too, raising further concerns of Labour's racist attitudes, since these included black Lambeth councillor in Sonia Winifred and a Hindu councillor in Deepak Sardaval. They've been suspended for 3 months, and Portuguese councillor Serena de Silva has been suspended for 2 months, all for backing a ceasefire which Labour in Parliament voted for. So why then have these suspensions not been overturned, not binned as ridiculous and overruled by London Labour? Well, the only conclusion we can draw, and this is far more believable than Starmer actually backing a ceasefire and meaning it, is that it's all a big fat lie, all designed to basically wreck the SNP's attempt at censoring Israel. And that is actually all Labour sought to achieve at parliamentary level. This is a Labour Party happier to be ignoring genocide than have Labour members or representatives dissenting over it. Abrams has issued a statement to his constituents. On Monday night, I was suspended indefinitely from Lambeth Labour Group for breaking the whip after I voted for a motion that called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza at January's Lambeth Full Council meeting. As someone with a small platform and as a councillor with a very diverse ward with sizable Muslim and Jewish communities, I have been consistent in condemning the horrific attacks by Hamas on October 7th. But I have also been clear that one crime does not justify another, and I believe in Gaza we are witnessing one of the greatest crimes of our age. As someone from a Jewish background, I have found the past 4 months to be emotionally challenging, both personally and professionally, amid the constant stream of horrific images coming out of Gaza. As a parent myself, the images of children killed or maimed in the Israeli bombardment have had a terrible impact on my mental health. My suffering, however, is incomparable to the pain, loss and suffering that people are facing in Gaza as I write this statement. Over the last 4 months, I have had countless conversations with local residents in Streatham about the war in Gaza. I have responded to dozens of emails. I've been to Friday prayers at the local mosque and Erev Shabbat at the local synagogue. I've been to vigils with the Jewish community calling for the release of Israeli hostages, and I have been on Palestine solidarity marches. First and foremost, I have listened, and the vast majority of people I have spoken to want an immediate end to the violence, and that is reflective of the country and the Labour Party membership, with the latest polls showing 66% of voters wanting an immediate ceasefire and 89% of Labour Party voters. My vote for the ceasefire motion was a matter of conscience for me. My great-grandparents were persecuted and driven from Eastern Europe over 100 years ago in the pogroms of Kiev and came to this country as refugees with nothing, leaving and losing many close family in the process. It is exactly this history of persecution of my close ancestors in Europe over the ages that meant I was brought up to always stand with the oppressed and against oppression. And when I say never again, I mean never again for everybody. I will continue to serve as councillor for St Leonard's Ward and continue to work tirelessly for every single member and resident of our vibrant and diverse community of Streatham. It doesn't matter what creed, colour or religious persuasion you are. Despite Labour backing a ceasefire and a parliamentary vote, nothing's changed at all. Labour can again just point to backing one, but won't actually do anything to work towards one actually happening. And when they are still suspending councillors, including Jewish ones who happen to also vote for a ceasefire motion, for meaning it when they say they want a ceasefire, you know nothing has changed. Starmer did what he did, got Lindsay Hoyle to do what he did, on the face of party conduct since, for no other reason than to again shield Israel from blame whilst it carries on committing a genocide. We need many more Martin Abrams, and we definitely need one fewer Keir Starmers. Solidarity for all those speaking up for an end to the bloodshed. In no meaningful way will that ever come from Labour. In fact, they and the Tories are right now equally bad at whipping up significant anti-Muslim sentiment, fearing for their own backsides amid claims of a terrorist threat that I'd really like to see evidence of, given Hoyle suddenly coming up with that as an apparent reason for his rule breaking, but also because the Islamophobic attacks have ramped up once more. Further distraction from what is happening in Israel and Gaza, as this video recommendation will explain all about, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so as you might well be aware, representations to the International Court of Justice have continued from a multitude of different sources, different nations over the last several days against Israel over its ongoing genocide in Gaza. If you thought that South Africa's ruling was the be-all and end-all of this right now, far from it. But amongst all the testimonies that have been made, many powerful, many hard-hitting, the one that has stood out for many was the presentation given by Professor Ralph Wilde, an expert in international humanitarian law from University College London, who spoke at the ICJ representing the Arab League of Nations, a collective of nations spanning the Middle East and North Africa, because it's possibly the most subtly damning destruction of every excuse Israel have made to be doing what they're doing in the most clever, most astonishing way you will have ever heard. Right, so the Arab League presentation to the International Court of Justice has been one of the real highlights of recent days, the ongoing court cases in the ICJ, with every excuse, every attempted justification by Israel of what they are doing absolutely eviscerated. And on top of that, exposes the reality of what the Zionist settler colonialist mentality in Palestine is and was all about. And actually, I had my mind absolutely blown by it, because there is so much I either hadn't put two and two together on or simply never knew that Wilde brought up in his presentation. Professor Ralph Wilde began by referring to the creation of Israel as a denial of the Palestinian right to legal self-determination as a result of a century-long, violent, colonial, racist effort to establish a nation-state exclusively for the Jewish people. When you start things off that way, well, it's pretty hard to ignore what is being said. And your ears do kind of prick up to what is coming next, because you're thinking, hello, this is a little bit of a different approach, even when it is spoken as quietly and evenly as Wilde did throughout his entire presentation. And Wilde spoke of Zionism being forcibly implemented following World War I, altering the demographic context of the region, softening the area up in effect to have a stronger case to establish a Jewish state in the region. So many of us, we think of 1948 and the Nakba as being the forced displacement of Palestinians to make room for Jewish colonialists to move in and take over even further beyond the establishment of the State of Israel. But actually that skips over what happened in the previous few decades, where Palestinians were already being forced out for Jewish settlers, to the point that the population of Palestine was 11% Jewish just after World War I. Non-Jewish Palestinians got displaced and were being displaced even then, and that was regardless of their own direct personal links to the areas they were being moved from. Of course, we hear all the time that Israel belongs to the Jewish people. There is no Palestine, they say. Yet here we are going back a little over 100 years, and the displacement of Palestinians, 90% of the population, was already happening. And Jewish people at that point could hardly say they have this right to the land then, because what was happening was basically blatant white privilege. Palestinians were moved on for Jewish settlers. No right of return. Everything we, by and large, who are interested and horrified in equal measure by what is happening in Gaza now, who have read some history, look at the 5 times Israel and surrounding Arab nations, including Palestine, have gone to war with each other since Israel was formed. Well, we in the West are not well educated on these matters, figuring everything began with that formation of Israel and the Nakba that followed, and that simply isn't true, because it goes back before then, to when Palestine was still British controlled, and how badly this country actually shafted the Palestinian people for the sake of the Jewish people, and even now we're still doing it despite the mess doing that has created out there. So we're post-World War I. The Treaty of Versailles has been signed. The war was over. Forming part of that treaty was something called the Covenant of the League of Nations, and Professor Wilde drew particular attention to Article 22 of this covenant, which is lengthy in and of itself, and I won't go into it all, but the first bit of it reads, "To those colonies and territories which, as a consequence of the late war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility, and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League." So effectively, because Palestine was British controlled, it fell under the classification of one of these colonies aforementioned in Article 22. British controlled as Palestine was, and unable to support itself at that time. Therefore, Britain was obligated to help it stand on its own 2 feet. But we didn't do that. As Professor Wilde explains, Palestine should have had its recognition as an independent state provisionally recognised during that time. But instead, the UK and other League Covenant signatories sought to incorporate the 1917 Balfour Declaration into it, the right for Jewish people to have a state of their own, into that same right for Palestinian self-determination. The thing is, that was completely illegal. There was literally no legal basis whatsoever that this could and should have been undertaken. They had no mandate for that. They had no legal power to do any of it. Yet they went ahead anyway. Now, I found this darkly hilarious because it means the State of Israel is entirely built on a lie, built on illegalities and abuses of law, and despite their claims to have some divine right to the land they occupy, legally they have no right to it whatsoever. The UK, and others who supported them, broke the law on this. It's something that Wilde called acting ultra vires, these Latin phrases that perpetuate legal speak, but that basically means beyond the powers, having done something that requires legal authority, but was done without it. I mean, there are ways of starting an argument to blow away all manner of Israeli excuses for their actions, but demonstrating in a court of law, the world court at that Israel don't actually have any right to exist built on any legal basis, and pointing out exactly why this is, just drives a monster truck clean over every excuse they come out with. Because at the end of the day, if Israel have no right to exist, they have no rights at all. Israel is a nation built without legal foundation. And I just find that incredible. We refer to the crisis in the Middle East as a 75-year-long war of attrition, but it's more like a 100-year-long legal cover-up. That has seen an entire people persecuted by an imperial colonial mindset. The British Empire still alive and kicking in Palestine, in effect. That's Zionism, folks, maintaining the cover-up since 1919. It gets even worse, though. Following World War II, a new right to self-determination for colonial peoples came into existence, which was supplementary to the League Covenant. However, by 1947, a proposal to create a state for the Jewish people and partition Palestine was proposed. And of course, in 1948 came to fruition as the State of Israel came into being. By 1948, the Jewish population of Palestine, incidentally, had risen to some 75% of the population. So the colonialists who had no legal right to be there had been doing some serious colonising, now so far outweighing the Palestinian people that, of course, this was going to go ahead. Again, for the second time, legal protections, legal rights were ignored. And of course, what happened then was a fight back which was lost, not least due to Western support for the newly minted Israel, which led to the Nakba, and even more displacement of more Palestinians with no right to return. Twice over, Palestinian rights to self-determination, to exist in light of global events outside their control, led to them being shafted, shunned and excluded, persecuted. The UN admitted Israel as a member, all in defiance of Palestine's legal right to exist, and Israel lacking any legal basis to. I am genuinely astounded that this was even possible. I'm astounded at the testimony of Professor Wilde giving this explanation as to why Israel in fact has no legal right to be. It is only now in a court of law, taking in all of Israel's crimes since its inception and the crimes of Zionism before that much of this is coming to light, and it's one hell of a history lesson. Nothing Israel say they have this right to or that right to counts for anything when they as an entity, they as a nation, lack any legal basis to exist, unlike the Palestinians. As Professor Wilde stated following this explanation, Israel is not the legal continuation or successor of the mandate. This violation of Palestinian self-determination is ongoing and unresolved. Two key elements are, first, Palestinian people not displaced from the land proclaimed to be of Israel in 1948, and their descendants are being forced to live as citizens. Presently they constitute 17.2% of a state conceived to be of and for another racial group, under the domination of that group, necessarily treated as second class because of their race. And second, Palestinian people displaced from that land and their descendants cannot return. These are serious breaches of the right of self-determination, the prohibitions of racial discrimination and apartheid, and the right of return. They must end immediately. Those 2 points are really important, because for anyone who figures the Nakba happened in 1948, it simply started then. It has continued and still continues to this day. We also appear to have a few more ways of describing Israel now, it would seem. The illegal state of Israel, perhaps. The land proclaimed to be of Israel. I quite like that, quite flowery. The stolen land of Palestine, maybe. I'm sure you can come up with some more and varied variations. But yes, Israel doesn't have a legal basis to be, it would appear. Professor Wilde's full presentation is on YouTube as well. The We Love Africa channel have it. All 26 minutes of it. And I really do suggest you watch the whole of it, because this entire video has been based on just the first 6 minutes. He went on so much further and into so much more that I could sit here for an hour literally going over what this guy said, than what the little bit I've spoken about here saved to make the video too long. This is what I mean by Israel being so well and truly done for now, so totally and momentously screwed. And the full presentation is well worth watching, as this theme of Israel's lack of a right to exist undermines everything they have said and done since, through the 1967 Six-Day War, the occupation of the remaining Palestinian territories and more. This ought to put into context further the UN's urging to end arms sales to Israel. A fair question is, why would any country be arming a nation which has no legal basis to exist in order to defend itself, allegedly, but in actual fact is being done to attack a nation which actually does very much have a legal basis to exist? More on that story in this video recommendation here, and I hopefully will catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Gaza demonstrations, protests and marches around this country. Rishi Sunak this week is currently complaining about mob rule on the front pages of some of the more Tory-friendly papers. And you've had Home Secretary James Cleverly complaining in other newspapers that protesters have made their point and should stop protesting as plans are made to do anything but stop. There are many more examples besides that coming from the government to clamp down on protests that are basically embarrassing them now. Perhaps instead of complaining that people aren't happy with you, you might actually think about addressing those issues. Instead, the people are daring to speak out against you, call Rishi Sunak a rat-faced what's-it or words to that effect. But more importantly, point out the fact they are aiding and abetting in a genocide that the vast majority of the British public are against. Instead of acting as our representatives, these lot prefer to lord over us instead, and the language and attitudes now being put on show these lot are very much plotting a police state right now to shut us up rather than listen to us. Right, so I'm going to start with the police for a second. Over the last several years, several months definitely, last year certainly, they've been given new powers to deal with protests, haven't they? And we've seen some stupidly heavy-handed actions from the police, such as the Sarah Everard vigil, for example. And at other times, and despite the new powers granted to them by the Public Order Bill that Suella Braverman steamrolled through, as far as the Gaza demonstrations have gone, there again have been issues of police heavy-handedness. The police have institutionally always been anti-demonstration. It's worked for them. Unnecessary as that attitude is, but for the most part, the many weekly marches we've seen have been perfectly peaceful. I mean, compare the Gaza protesters marching through London or other cities in the hundreds of thousands to the scenes that we witnessed at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Day last year, when Tommy Robinson and a handful of his brain cell deficient knuckle-dragger brigade made what is meant to be a solemn day memorial into a street fight. Now that should have been embarrassing. Could also have been a lot worse if the Met Police Chief hadn't ignored Braverman's demands to deploy more police to a peace march being organised elsewhere, determined that they would be the problem, her shrivel-eyed hard-right lunacy being proven wrong as the police, despite being mostly in the right place, still struggled that day. But again, what we're seeing is a message that it is those marching for what is right and good and decent, and at a bare minimum reasonable, that are again being targeted because we have a government unwilling to listen to them. And actually, when you consider the reasons for these marches, for a free Palestine, for an end to the genocide, the bending over backwards again just shouts that our politicians, and not just the Tory ones, are more interested in listening to Israel and their lobbyists than the people who vote and elect them. But then with a voter system that ensures one or other of those parties always takes power, why should they listen to us? They can forever and a day just take turns with each other and be perfectly content with that. Where's their incentive to listen to us in that? Why not try and just rule and control us instead? The marches are going to keep happening because this country won't stop aiding and abetting Israel. For as long as the politicians don't listen, we'll carry on, and so we now have this accusation of Sunak telling police chiefs that it is time to end mob rule. His words, not well chosen ones either, because the only mob ruling this country right now is the one led by the unelected, mandateless Sunak himself. I suppose he's running out of other terms to describe protesters that haven't resonated and haven't worked to turn public opinion against the marches. Seeing kids on social media with their limbs getting blown off is harder hitting than calling them hate marches or the people in them terrorist sympathisers. It hasn't worked, has it? It's hilarious in one respect because it was only the other day he suspended the Tory whip from Lee Anderson saying words matter and language matters. Just not his, apparently. He's different. He's special. He's rich. Quite frankly, if I was the police, I'd arrest him on the spot and take him to an interview room and ask for his confession on all of that. But I suppose if this likely direction of police state travel I alluded to a moment ago comes to pass, there will be plenty more to interview Sunak over in the future. Then there is Home Secretary James Stupidly, of course, where Sunak has gone to the Daily Mail and the Tory Graph, the usual Tory papers, to say his piece on mob rule. Cleverly went to the Times, just as bad, but also the Independent and the Guardian, frankly also just as bad, though try harder to pretend otherwise, saying to the Gaza protesters, OK, you made your point. Well, clearly no, they haven't, because you're still not listening. You haven't changed anything. You're still arming Israel. You're still supporting Israel. You don't back a ceasefire. And now we're hearing about possible restrictions on protest. This is a human right, the right to protest. It's not something you gift us out of the kindness of your hearts. It is our right. You start going down this road, you're going to end up in court, likely having your balls handed to you in the process. We're too close to an election now for you to try and bin the Human Rights Act again, but what is being touted as a longer notice period from 6 days under the current legislation to several weeks to organise and notify about a planned protest. Well, it just means more planning in advance. People will do that. They won't let this stop them. You're taking a very them and us attitude with this, and people will see you as their opponents on this. Cleverly can moan, well, they aren't saying anything new. That's because the message remains the same, Jimbo. He's complaining no MP should feel bullied into changing their stance. But I would remind you that you're a representative of your constituents. You are actually supposed to listen to them and take their concerns on board, take their concerns to Parliament, not put party first all the time, as clearly you do, and feel threatened as a result of that. Well, the problem for the Tories is these protests are seen as a hindrance, as a drag, as a bore, because people like Sunak and Stupidly are not appalled at all by the images of genocide we're witnessing on social media. They can't be, because even if they've seen them, it's not changing their moods or their stance. And they'll be called out for that, and are being called out for that, week after week after week, for as long as it's going to take. They cannot stop the protests. They're moaning to the police about it, but can't stop them, both because the protests are organised within the current legislation, and because they can't change stance without upsetting the lobbyists, looking over their shoulders, and possibly losing the donations that come with that. The people protesting, I'm sure, would rather they didn't have to go out each week and still attempt to shame a government that doesn't seem to feel any shame to change what it's doing. I'm sure there's plenty of other things they would rather be doing. But neither will the government meet with these people to show any hint of addressing the situation, because frankly, on an intellectual level, they're far too terrified to do that. For as long as people feel a political point needs to be made, and for as long as the government ignore that, the protest will continue. If you don't like that, tough. Of course, the other weapon that's being deployed by the Tories here is racism again. Accusations that the protesters are anti-Semitic for calling out Israeli atrocity. Now, as much as the Israel lobby will, I'm sure, appreciate that, it's opened up another racism can of worms, because many politicians have, of course, blamed an Islamist agenda as being behind this. Lee Anderson, I'll come back to him again. He said London Mayor Sadiq Khan is allowing these protests to happen because he's controlled by the Islamists. And that, of course, got him suspended. This gave Labour, no better by any stretch on this score as the number of independent candidates planning to stand against pro-Israel Labour MPs shows, the chance to accuse the Tories of having an Islamophobia problem, which on Sky produced this hilarious response from the overpaid and frightfully over-promoted Kay Burley.
The Conservatives are not prepared to acknowledge the problem that's in front of them, then I don't see how action can follow from that. The first step in dealing with the problem is to acknowledge that there is a problem. If they're not prepared to accept that what Lee Anderson said is racist and Islamophobic, then that's pretty serious.
Do you not acknowledge, though, what the Prime Minister is saying, given that his ethnicity, it proves that the government isn't Islamophobic?
So the Tories can't be Islamophobia because Sunak is what? Brown-skinned? Can't be because he's Muslim, because he isn't Muslim. He's Hindu. Oh, but while we're on the subject of racism being weaponised again, another person getting the blame here too is Jeremy Corbyn. Yes, because of course he is. The anti-Semitism scan has been overplayed and people aren't having it anymore. The Islamophobia on show is now endangering more people in those communities, now fearing repercussions by those simple-minded enough to still believe what our politicians and their loyal media mouthpieces tell them. But as far as demonstrations go, they won't end. People will keep finding a way through, and so the government can either listen, which it will never seemingly do, or it will seek to clamp down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression even more, whilst bemoaning their own safety instead of worrying about the actual people actually being endangered. It was far-right, dishonest and irresponsible rhetoric that has led to the deaths of MPs before, as we know, we remember them. Yet here they are, again, our politicians actually stoking hate against others whilst worrying about themselves. And of course this has been thrust into the spotlight more by the current Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, and whatever happened between him and Keir Starmer behind closed doors as his excuse to shaft the SNP over a Gaza ceasefire. Maybe learn some lessons from what happened before, rather than being so dishonest about it, and maybe MP safety, whilst being a legitimate concern, wouldn't be as much of one. The Tories have already done so much to trash the right to protest with the Public Order Bill. Who's to say they won't go further if given the chance? Clearly not working as well as they hoped it would. We have Sunak calling demos mob rule and promising to do whatever it takes to crack down on the violence and aggression seen at protests, except more often than not, that has come from the police, not the protesters. But when the protesters are carrying a message the government will not agree with, and in light of Sunak and stupidly meeting with police chiefs this week, protecting our right to protest when they don't like the protests is not what is going to happen. Things will tighten up further if they're allowed to do it. Their friends in the media will help them in that. And this business of MPs being in danger isn't being let go of. Trevor Phillips on Sky sat there and invoked Oliver Cromwell storming Parliament and holding MPs at sword point if they didn't act as he wished. That is not happening now. And that, coming from Phillips, a man who was suspended from Labour over Islamophobia allegations, but quietly readmitted by Starmer without, it seems, ever being censured for it, is just horrible optics, but again plays into that mob rule mentality. If it perseveres, if this narrative succeeds in getting into people's heads, then the government will feel justified that it can get away with clamping down on protest even more. So expect to hear a lot more about MPs worrying for their own safety in the media as a means to soften us all up for further restrictions on our right to protest, and likely more police powers along with it to make sure we do, which is just one more step towards a police state. Legitimate scrutiny, organising and demonstrating cannot and should not be criminalised. It is our right. But if they can convince us that it's necessary for their safety, arguably our safety, and the media keeps saying it too, then expect things to keep moving in that direction. And it won't matter if it is Sunak or Starmer in charge to see that happen. And whilst they will legislate to protect themselves more, they'll also end up legislating to protect us all less. Both the Tories and Labour were again on the same page when it comes to our right to see an actual doctor, for example, and not one of the fake ones that they're pushing, physicians' associates, by making sure the lines between the two remain blurred as their quick fix to make up doctors' vacancies in the NHS, something not nearly enough people are aware of. But you can inform yourself about that with this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so George Galloway has won the Rochdale by-election, but he didn't just win it, it was a landslide. Yet the media are going to great lengths to excuse this win as somehow exceptional. Several mouthpieces referring to it as a win in special circumstances, and although certainly there's been a lot of controversy leading up to this by-election, and even on the night of it, actually none of that mattered. Because Galloway first and foremost stood on a platform on a subject that he's been consistent on for decades, Israel and Palestine. And no matter what you think of the man himself, how you might criticise him, whether you like him or you do not like him, what he's done in the past that has certainly courted controversy, and goodness knows the media are deploying that again now, but what he has shown here, and what the result has actually shown, is that a continuation by the two mainstream parties to back Israel, in light of them committing some of the worst atrocities in living memory, is a vote killer, and a small party, or even an independent, can and will beat them, both when they stand for what is right and what is just. Right, so election night last night got off to a bit of a bumpy start, as all hell broke loose, frankly. The returning officer was called in early at one depot. The police were also called to the Deeplish Community Centre, where George Galloway's team had caught Labour, red-handed, engaging in corruption for a candidate that their party had allegedly, formally, already disowned, aided and abetted by a clerk who got sacked on the spot. It turned out that Galloway's campaign manager had discovered that Labour canvassers were being allowed to speak to voters outside, and that voting without ID was being permitted. How much this benefited Labour's former candidate in that particular location, we don't know. A candidate Starmer blew off because he knew he was going to lose the seat and needed to save face. The candidate Azhar Ali had dared voice a contrasting opinion on the events of October 7th of that of Starmer's Labour, the established line. He shared Egypt's view of said events instead of Starmer's, Egypt claiming to have warned Israel about Hamas plans well in advance of October 7th. Well, justifiably chagrined by the treatment by his party and knowing he would still appear on the ballot for Labour, Ali carried on and painted himself as an anti-Starmer candidate from then onwards, but all in all it amounted to nothing, as George Galloway, very much already the anti-Starmer candidate, ended up wiping the floor with his opponents and taking Rochdale for his Workers' Party of Britain. Turnout in Rochdale, considering this was a by-election, was not bad. 39.7% was the turnout, roughly 2/3 of typical general election turnout, and of that, Galloway took 39.7% of the vote, giving him a not indecent majority of 5,697. Obviously, he only holds the seat for a matter of months before things go to a general election, date still to be determined, but having stood on a platform not just on Gaza, but also on local hospital, local medical care, particularly maternity care as well, he has a bit of a time to prove his worth to his new constituents. Aside from Galloway winning, though, the remaining results were no less interesting for a number of reasons. For anyone thinking Galloway's win is just him proving a point on Gaza, this being a single-issue by-election in a constituency with a large Muslim voter base, as a lot of people have looked at it as, the second-place candidate was also an independent, a local mechanic called Dave Tully, who has come in from nowhere. He only started his campaign something like 4 weeks ago. He's had no press attention whatsoever. And as Galloway took nearly 40% of the vote, Tully actually took 21% of it himself. He did extraordinarily well. And so between them both, took close to 2/3 of the available vote, 2/3 of turnout. The Tories came third, barely getting little more than half of what Tully did, let alone Galloway. Labour were still on the ballot. Azhar Ali kept campaigning, but they lost a catastrophic 43.9% of their vote. And they'll excuse it by saying, oh, well, we ditched our candidate. But functionally, most people, when they go to vote, don't know about the candidate, don't much care about the candidate, and vote for the party. As much as people are falling over themselves on social media to excuse Labour on this basis, Ali was on the ballot as the Labour candidate. People will have voted accordingly, except so very many didn't. The former Labour MP for Rochdale turned Reform UK candidate, therefore about as welcome as a fart in a lift, Simon Danzer, came 6th. Labour losing such a massive chunk of their vote meant they secured just 7.7%, the lowest vote share from Labour in Rochdale ever. Labour's next lowest result was a third place showing back in 1918 when they stood for the very first time in Rochdale, and even then got more than double what they did last night. They got 16.9%. Here's a bit of what Galloway said in his acceptance speech that I want to draw attention to.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price for the role that you have played in enabling, encouraging and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Palestine in the Gaza Strip.
Now, Rochdale has been a Labour seat since the Blair landslide, and they just lost it extraordinarily heavily. They will make their excuses, but they knew they were losing this seat. They know they've lost vast swathes of their Muslim voter base, and there is little chance of them winning it back, refusing to budge an inch on their pro-Israel stance. They will arguably lose even more, and that is exactly what Galloway was getting at there. Starmer has been warned, but he isn't listening, and he never will. Starmer expects to win the general election by saying, I don't actually care what you think about me or my party. If you want the Tories out, then you will vote for me. He said even that is a lie, when he's no different to the Tories at all, especially on Israel and Gaza. Now, we who spend an inordinate amount of time studying the politics of all of this know this already, as do the media. But whereas we embrace Labour and the Tories losing seat after seat as they absolutely deserve to, come the next general election, those who benefit from the status quo and the media, many of them who own or control or influence, are also straining to get themselves heard. Chris Williamson, former Labour MP as well, now in Galloway's party, was interviewed during the vote count by the BBC. And this is what went on.
The fact is that the Labour Party is facilitating a genocide that's taken place before our very eyes. It's absolutely outrageous that the Labour Party, of all political parties, which has always had a strong peace contingent within it, is now actually supporting genocide.
OK, if we can maybe just avoid that language, if that's OK for now, because that is something that may well offend some people.
It may offend, but even the International Court of Justice have acknowledged that there is a plausible genocide going on. When you see the Israelis massacring people who are starving.
He's absolutely bang on there, and I think Williamson's tone was very much the one we've all had in response to Labour and Tory attitudes over the last 4 months of genocide in Gaza. But the BBC were more interested in trying to get Williamson to not say the word genocide. The ICJ has ruled a plausible case for this exists. This is the BBC. We pay for this. Absolute failures. Other media were just as bad. I'm not sharing the video footage of this one, it was just dross. But ITV decided to do a Who is George Galloway segment, ensuring they talked all about what he's done previously, what he said previously, from pretending to be a cat on Big Brother to hanging out with Steve Bannon and Nigel Farage. You can fault the man all you like. Goodness knows there's multiple reasons why you can. But if you make it all about his controversies, then you're actually covering up the reasons he actually won here. You don't have to like Galloway one iota to ultimately recognise why he has won, and absolutely he now has to demonstrate he can be a decent local MP, or he won't last beyond the next general election. Galloway won because whatever you think of him, his support for Palestine and Gaza is a long one and a consistent one. A record of opposing abhorrent warmongering foreign policy. It is his opposition to the Iraq war that sort of slung out of Labour under Tony Blair. Whatever you think of him as a man or as a politician, he's not a weather vane on matters like this. He has Starmer banged to rights. Now Starmer will have to face him in Parliament on this, on the fact he didn't back the SNP amendment, or motion even, on the fact he scuppered that vote with Labour's amendment, and is working overtly to oppose a ceasefire that points the finger at the people committing genocide, instead pointing it more at those on the receiving end, blaming Hamas almost 5 months on from their attack on one night of October 7th, as bad as that is and condemnable as it is. But that is perverse in light of the overwhelmingly disproportionate response that has been going on in Gaza, committed by Israel for the entire time since. People see it, they recognise it, they're seeing through it, they're appalled by it, and they won't back people defending that. And who still are. The Tories announcing plans to curb pro-Palestine protests, and Labour have of course now come out in support of that, like they always do. Keir Starmer himself said in 2020 that, let's be brutally honest with ourselves. When you lose an election in a democracy, you deserve to. You don't look at the electorate and ask them, what were you thinking? You look at yourself and ask, what were we doing? For once, I completely agree with you, Keith. Other Labour figures, though, have been completely batshit. This is what supposed journalist turned Starmer lickspittle Paul Mason said after Galloway's win. Galloway's victory in Rochdale is a which side are you on moment, both for the left and Democrats everywhere. The number one task is to isolate and ostracise him, and any politicians and activists aligning with him. Treat him like the Greek Parliament treated Golden Dawn. He won the mandate of the people of Rochdale, and you're now demanding Parliament do something about that? Like what? Golden Dawn, you brought them up. So you want him arrested for winning then? The man is absolutely unhinged, but this also shows the arrogance and entitlement from the Red Tories of Team Keith. Rochdale is, according to the 2021 census, the 18th most Muslim constituency in the UK, and I think I'm right looking at the list that every constituency above Rochdale in that table is also a Labour seat. Looking at what Labour lost by vote percentage, those MPs in those seats should be very, very nervous. What should make them even more nervous than even that influence of the Muslim vote there is that despite that large Muslim population, Rochdale as a constituency is still 75% white. So this argument about it being all about Muslims walking away from Labour actually is a lot broader. Far more than just Muslim people are abandoning Labour and its pro-Israel leanings, and that being the reason for it. Backing Israel has every chance of destroying Labour and Starmer. A smaller party or an independent standing on a platform in the similar way as Galloway did for an immediate ceasefire on the side of Gaza against Israel, backing BDS, backing sanctions, backing arms sales bans. There's a lot of Muslim votes that clearly, as Rochdale implies, would get behind them, but not just Muslim votes. Labour MPs will never be allowed to take such a stance as that. They have a serious Starmer problem if they're hoping to get re-elected. They have a serious Zionism problem, and it's going to cost them if they don't do something about it. On top of that, we have the weaponization of Islamophobia going on by both the Tories and Labour right now, determined to attack those communities, endanger them, and not actually appeal to them. Punishing them for what? Voting against you? Oh, how dare they? Votes that have been taken for granted are not only lost, but being actively spurned here. In a general election where the Tories are going to pieces and Labour should be looking towards taking power quite easily, that is anything but certain now, and it does come down to this. Galloway went on in his acceptance speech by mentioning Ilford, where Wes Streeting has his seat, where he is being challenged by a local independent woman, a British Palestinian, Leanne Mohammed. He mentioned his old seat at Bethnal Green and Bow, where Rushanara Ali faces a challenge by lawyer Tasneem Akunji. And actually, if Andrew Feinstein does accept his nomination to stand against Keir Starmer, the Labour leader himself is in an inordinate amount of trouble by the looks of this. And then, of course, there is the Muslim vote movement, which has sprung up, and I've discussed on other videos, which is literally going to be facilitating who to vote for based on this and other related issues for Muslim people. If you want one takeaway from this election that sets aside George Galloway, it is this. If ever there was a time where an independent candidate can make a real run at Parliament and succeed in beating the establishment parties, quite clearly it is now. But it requires organisation locally and quickly, because time is running out. So if you've got a really rotten MP you really don't like and you really want to do something about them, well, now's the time, because you really can do something about that. Independent candidates are springing up everywhere. You can get more details on more of them on this video recommendation here. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so for as much as far too many of our politicians on both sides of the house right now are in hock to the Israel lobby, happy to do their bidding, aid and abet them in their genocide, and continue to ignore the overwhelming will of the British people who want a ceasefire, we don't look at our media in the same way, and we probably should. We know MPs get lobbied. We know they get lots of lovely perks via associated groups, such as Labour Friends of Israel and the Tory equivalent. The anti-Semitism scam against Jeremy Corbyn saw a number of newspapers come out and accuse him of being weak on tackling the issue, being anti-Semitic himself, and doing whatever was within their power to do so. The Guardian was notable for this, particularly Jewish journalist Jonathan Friedland. But as much as we can surmise he might have had pro-Israel leanings from what he wrote, his mother incidentally was Israeli-born. Read into that what you will. Though Friedland once wrote she was even more hawkish than he was on matters relating to Israel. But this isn't about Friedland, at least not in any sense I'm aware of, because another far more blatant example of entryism into the media by Israel has been uncovered in the US. And it has begged the question, how could this have happened, and has it happened elsewhere? Is it happening here? Right, so pro-Israeli headlines in our mainstream media, they are nothing new to us, but we take such things with a heavy pinch of salt these days when we can read an article one moment and then witness the bare, uncensored imagery of what is happening in Gaza right now on social media as we see the genocide actually play out, without any filter, no bias. And although in this era of deep fakes it's no longer necessarily true to say the camera doesn't lie, when the images are so numerous and coming from so many different sources, and have been happening consistently for so long, we know beyond doubt what we're witnessing to be true. We know the power of the mainstream media. We know its power to influence and distort as well as inform. Those of us on the left of politics, those of us who were supporters and activists for Corbyn's Labour, as I was, knew the power they had, the influence they could bring to bear from daily attack pieces on Corbyn, accusing a lifelong anti-racist of being a literal danger to Jewish life in the UK. Certainly worth remembering, as MPs currently claim to fear for their own safety, as they are in the news now, when Corbyn being attacked, or with people camping on his doorstep or climbing on his roof even, when by these same people worrying about themselves now, we're laughing about that then. And whether you liked Corbyn or not, surely the hypocrisy of that is something you can acknowledge and agree with. But there's been a scandal stateside which might imply that Israel are upping their game, possibly. And again, the media has been complicit in this. The New York Times, one of the largest and most prestigious of US newspapers, has, it has been discovered, employed as a journalist a former member of the Israeli Defense Force, whose written work has amounted to little more than pro-Israel propaganda, all coming out after the paper ran a front-page piece by this individual smearing Palestinian resistance fighters as using systematic sexual violence. The article was co-written by a woman called Anat Schwartz, whose employment began at the New York Times late last year, when her first article was a piece called Screams Without Words, which became widely discredited due to the many unevidenced, unsubstantiated claims made regarding the night of October 7th, and accusations against Hamas, accusing them of using rape and mutilation against Israelis on that night, systematically using sexual violence as a weapon of war. The family of one alleged victim kicked up merry hell over it, said they'd been misled about the intent of the article, and whose story made up around a third of the whole article. A poor piece by a poor journalist, But then Schwartz wasn't just a poor journalist. She wasn't actually a journalist at all. In fact, what she was a filmmaker and former Israeli intelligence officer in the IDF. How in blazes did she get the job then? The New York Times is one of the biggest names in US journalism, one of their biggest papers, a prestigious place. That word's going to get used a lot, prestigious, I'm in a mood for it. Journalists across the world, never mind just the US, would give anything to give a byline in that paper. They can really say they've made it if they get into the New York Times. It's somehow a complete non-journalist got a gig there. How that happened absolutely needs to be made public, because if Israel can infiltrate the media there, I'm not saying that's exactly what has happened here, but if they can, then they can do it anywhere. Now, this Screams Without Words article came out in late December and was co-authored by three people. Jeffrey Gettleman, who is the South Asia bureau chief for the New York Times currently, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, however he's been caught out a time or two in the past, Jewish chap, along with Anat Schwartz and someone else called Adam Sella, who is based in Tel Aviv but works for the New York Times, and also happens to be Anat Schwartz's nephew by marriage, and at just 24, he's done amazingly well to be writing for the New York Times at such a young age as well, hasn't he? Now, Schwartz's husband, Dan Sella, posted a very interesting kind of an introduction to his wife in relation to that Screams Without Words piece. Made all the more interesting given the response I just mentioned from the family of one victim who were interviewed for it. He wrote on social media, 2 months of literally round-the-clock work ended yesterday when this devastating story was published. You know Anat Schwartz is a filmmaker, but a few days after October 7th, her life took a turn and she started drilling down into some of the most horrific angles of the Hamas attack. I was sceptical initially, but for Anat, my scepticism only makes the challenge more interesting. Anat and her fellow reporters, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Jeffrey Gettleman and my amazing nephew Adam Sella, interviewed over 150 people for this investigation, and the things they saw and heard were unbearable. The story is not for everyone. Parts of it will haunt you at night, but it's extremely important that the truth will be out. You should have stuck with your feelings of skepticism, Sunshine. Schwartz was not a journalist. She was a filmmaker as well as having been in the IDF. Gettleman, for his part, Pulitzer Prize or not, has a track record of overt pro-Israel leanings and also making stuff up, completely fabricating a quote, for example, by former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe when he was an Africa correspondent. Schwartz herself wasn't exactly working around the clock either. She still found time for social media too. She liked a post on October 7th calling for Gaza to be turned into a slaughterhouse. A post that was so damning, South Africa actually cited it in their case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. She also liked a post relating to the long debunked story about 40 beheaded babies, and also liked another post, this one a lot more sinister given the position she had got herself into, relating to building an effective propaganda campaign to equate Hamas with ISIS. What wonderful journalistic integrity that was on show. You cannot have journalists more interested in making news than reporting it. That's insane, especially in light of the New York Times having fired another reporter, Jasmine Hughes, simply for signing a letter opposing Israel's genocide. That certainly puts that paper's bias on this issue starkly on show. So why did the New York Times hire Schwartz? Was it their doing? Was it something they planned because of their bias? It does at least seem plausible, given how they treated Hughes. Did they want someone who would just frame Palestinians as subhuman monsters, and Schwartz was willing to do it, journalist or no? And it very much is no, since she had never, ever worked as a journalist anywhere else ever before she got this gig at one of the most prestigious papers in America, churning out gut-wrenching filth that served only the interests of the Israeli propaganda machine and has brought that prestigious publication into severe disrepute. But could it have been something else? Did Schwartz present herself to the New York Times as something she wasn't? Did she fraudulently gain employment there? Did her former intelligence training help her do that? What are we to make of other former intelligence operatives who may have ingratiated themselves into the media, or politics even? Because I'm thinking right now of Asaf Kaplan, who Keir Starmer hired to spy on members' social media, facilitating his purge to the left. Kaplan was also IDF intelligence. I'm honestly leaning towards the former. I'm sure she was a fantastic state intelligence asset, but this really does smack of a paper with an agenda, employing someone prepared to do something no journalist of any reasonable professional integrity was prepared to. As this has come out, the staff are split at the New York Times. Half of them outraged at the abandonment of journalistic integrity, but that still leaves half of the newsroom who aren't. Annette Schwartz and the New York Times are apparently parting ways now. But that really is only because this has all been found out, isn't it? The paper has launched an investigation, but what will it find in investigating itself? Frankly, this needs independent investigation, because people need to know that if that paper has been compromised further, who enabled it, who's driving it, is this more malign Israeli influence higher up the chain? Who can trust any reporting on Israel coming from them now? Now, you can argue that this might just be one paper, one example of said propaganda being delivered, but it isn't. Arguably, a more damaging story was the one the Wall Street Journal ran, implying UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees, was laundering money for Hamas, which triggered the US and Genocide Joe to pull funding for UNRWA, which in turn triggered our government here in the UK to do likewise, because we copy the US all the time, and other nations did the same. UNRWA is still facing financial collapse right now and has given up trying to get aid into northern Gaza these days. That piece was written by a woman called Carrie Keller-Lynn, who had also served in the Israeli Defence Force. Fundamentally, the question is this happening in our media too? With the stories many of our rags turn out, how many more newspapers around the world could well be compromised? Perhaps journalistic integrity is sorely lacking as well. I certainly believe that. It's why this channel exists, after all. Meanwhile, as the Israeli propaganda machine continues to flex wherever it can find an outlet to spread its nonsense, Israel continues to be laid bare at the International Court of Justice. I covered an absolutely astonishing presentation on behalf of the Arab League of Nations on this video recommendation, where Israel's very right to exist is on legally rocky ground. Fascinating stuff I wasn't aware of. Do give it a look. It's a real learning curve. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so yesterday saw one of the single most egregious attacks on innocent Palestinian civilians by Israeli forces since the events on October 7th began, in an event now being referred to as the Flower Massacre. For as much as events in Gaza right now are tending to focus on Rafah and the vast majority of the Gazan population having been moved on and are now trapped there with nowhere else to go, not everyone has moved south for all manner of reasons. There are still Gazan people in the north of the Strip, what is left of it, having remained in refugee camps like Jabalia for the most part, though these people were all to the south of what is left of Gaza City at the time of this Flower Massacre. Aid to these people hasn't been able to be delivered for over a month now, until yesterday when aid trucks finally got through, only for the starving people who swarmed upon one to be opened fire upon, killing over 100 of them and injuring a further 700. Yet the takeaway from that, from one Israeli minister anyway, is that we should be more concerned about Israel's people than who their people are actually starving and killing. Right, so yesterday saw the appalling massacre of more than 100 people. Depending on the source, Quds Network say 150 killed, over 1,000 injured. Other media outlets are saying different numbers, so the numbers are very much still up for debate, still have to be firmed up. But a lot of people all the same, all for the sake of trying to get food from the first aid truck they'd seen in a month. Desperate doesn't cut it. How on earth these people have survived that long with literally nothing, living amongst the ruins of what was once northern Gaza, I can't fathom. Living on animal feed, I saw one report say. Imagine it, this is the first major aid delivery you've seen in over a month, and as you rush to grab some desperately needed food and water and other supplies, the people on the truck open fire on you instead. They fired into the crowd. They fired into the ensuing chaos. The people they were supposedly delivering aid to got slaughtered by them instead. It's being called the Flower Massacre because the name nails on exactly what it was and what it was over. And people won't forget that either. There was no Hamas there, just starving people. And to just cut 100 or more of them down as they did is just one more in the far too long litany of war crimes committed by Israel. In what way can Israel say they are only defending themselves over this? That they were exercising their rights to defend themselves here in this instance? There's no way they can here. These people will have been on the brink. You brought them food, and as they desperately run to claim their share, they get killed instead. Weak, hungry, defenceless people in search of food, and instead of just giving it to them, as was the job of this delivery, instead, in an act of off-the-charts savagery, the Israeli soldiers on delivery duty shot them instead. It was a massacre. It was a war crime. But the headlines, my God, they are twisted. The Washington Post said, chaotic aid delivery turns deadly. Well, deadly for whom? Not for Israel, certainly, because they were the ones who made it deadly, weren't they? CNN called it a chaotic incident. No, a chaotic incident is when a dog runs onto a football field in the middle of a match, not a massacre. The Guardian called them, this one is ridiculous, food aid-related deaths. What the hell does that even mean? They didn't choke to death on free biscuits, did they? They got gunned down. Absolutely unreal, inexcusable pretense that Israel is somehow not directly at fault. Of course they are. The reason these people are starving is because of Israel, and the reason they are now dead is because of Israel. Take the food out of the equation, it's still more honest than those headlines. Hamas didn't kill these people, Israel did. So say it, report the facts, tell people the real news, what exactly is going on, and not your skewed version of it. If it was Putin doing this, you can bet they damn well would be. Dozens of people were taken to Gaza's last remaining functional hospital. Not fully functional, I might add, which ironically is in the far north of the Gaza Strip, Kamal Adwan Hospital, as 300 injured people were brought in, along with 20 who had died by the time they got there, all brought in on the back of an empty food truck, perversely. So only a small fraction of the injured even got that far. And even that number was overwhelming what the hospital, functional as it is, could offer. Dr. Hossam Abu Safia, the hospital director, said, "This is what we were afraid of, frankly. We would be out of service and dozens of martyrs and wounded would come. As you can see, we are now working off the charging and battery system. The majority of cases need surgery and operations rooms. To be honest, I don't know what we can do. The situation, as you can see, is horrendous. Now we are working with only first aid or emergency." Well, of course they are. If no aid is getting into the north, and that includes medical aid too. But Israel's attitude to this? Well, put it this way, the IDF felt comfortable enough in their own actions to show aerial footage of the massacre, saying, aerial footage of the operation to bring humanitarian aid into the northern Gaza Strip, showing how the Palestinian crowd attacked the trucks, and as a result dozens were killed from overcrowding, crowding and trampling. A lie. They were shot, and we know this with certainty not just because we've seen images of the aftermath, but because an Israeli army spokesman admitted as much. Here's an excerpt of what Turkish-based Anadolu Agency reported. An Israeli military source admitted Thursday that the army opened fire on Palestinians waiting to receive humanitarian aid in Gaza City, leaving many dead and injured. The source, who preferred his name not mentioned, told Anadolu that the shooting took place near the humanitarian corridor that the army is establishing south of Gaza City. The deadly assault occurred when several Palestinians approached the Israeli force that was overseeing the entry of aid trucks into Gaza City, posing danger to the soldiers, prompting them to open fire, according to the source, who said the shooting is under investigation by the army. The army claimed that a stampede, while trying to distribute aid, caused casualties to the Palestinians, along with being struck by aid trucks. It said an initial investigation found some Palestinians approached an Israeli military checkpoint overseeing the entry of the trucks, with soldiers firing warning shots and shooting at the legs of Palestinians who continued to move towards the troops. The Gaza Health Ministry said at least 104 Palestinians were killed in the attack. Similarly to the lies of the IDF on social media, though, has come the appalling commentary coming from one Israeli minister bleating about the safety of the IDF in the aftermath of all of this, none of whom were shot, killed or injured, of course. And on that basis, he believes that aid to the north should be stopped entirely. Yet again, it is the hard-right ramblings of loudmouth Israeli Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir that this is coming from. He put out on social media in response to this massacre that total support must be given to our heroic fighters operating in Gaza, who acted excellently against a Gazan mob that tried to harm them. Today it was proven that the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza is not only madness, while our abductees are being held in the strip under substandard conditions, but also endangers the IDF soldiers. This is another clear reason why we must stop transferring this aid, which is in fact aid to harm the IDF soldiers and oxygen to Hamas. Madness to provide aid when they are stopping others from doing so, funnily enough. UNRWA, for example, have stopped trying to get aid into the north, not only because Israel is stopping them, but because their funding is drying up due to their lies too. Israel have perpetrated about them funding and supporting Hamas. You have settlers blocking aid trucks, preventing any aid entering the strip at all, and then laughing and cheering and dancing about it at the thought of starving the people within to death. Israel are not doing anything to stop them, not arresting them for obstruction, nothing. Neighbouring Jordan has taken the action to the skies now above Gaza to deliver aid drops and getting around these blockades of aid trucks, and pathetically even the US is apparently now considering this option, which if true shows they have completely lost control of their Israel project and still won't do anything to censure them. Delivering aid to innocent civilian people is harming IDF soldiers when it isn't, and giving oxygen to Hamas, which it also isn't. Ben-Gvir is a madman, a dreadful little man operating what basically amounts to a private police force in Shin Bet, which is his only ministerial relevance. He's advocating for the starvation of Gazans and praises for the IDF for killing them when coming for aid. Not only is this tweet appalling and actually admitting to a war crime, but actually what excuse has Twitter got for not having taken this tweet down for violent speech and incitement? I had to press the translate button to read it myself, written in Hebrew as it was. Are Twitter unable to flag up stuff like this in other languages, or is it a blind eye being cast instead? Ending aid whilst preventing others from delivering it is collective punishment, a war crime, and Ben-Gvir gets away with it internationally because too many are still shilling for Israel, and nationally because Netanyahu needs him to stay in power himself. He's going around doing and saying stuff believing he is completely untouchable, even admitting to the IDF killing these people when their official line was still that they got crushed due to overcrowding. He needs a day in The Hague alongside Netanyahu and the rest of this fascistic government, and the evidence just keeps mounting up against him and them. It is state-sponsored terror. Matters are not easing up at all in Gaza. They are being exacerbated, and politicians like Ben-Gvir are the political equivalent of those same IDF soldiers whose safety he fears for so much, posting their war crimes on social media for us all to see and celebrating what they're doing. He celebrates too. It's not necessarily all going Israel's way internationally, though, reliant as they are on arms sales from abroad, as the EU has recently done something to upset that particular apple cart. You can find out all about that story here if you watch my video recommendation next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, caused a fair bit of old buzz last night because apparently the country is descending into an anti-democratic mess, where people are afraid to leave their houses for fear of what might happen to them. And also George Galloway won a by-election, so that must be a sure sign that extremist disruption is on the rise. God forbid the will of the people is to walk away from you and your extremist government, along with Starmer, who supports you in this nonsense, Kel Surprise, because you're the one supporting a genocidal nation in Israel right now, not the British public. Sunak appears to be trying to manufacture some kind of national crisis here, and people are justifiably asking the question as to whether our unelected and mandateless Prime Minister, knowing he is certain to lose the next election, is manufacturing this crisis to avoid calling the general election itself. Right, so Sunak's message to the nation last night, nigh on 12 minutes of absolute blithering hard-right nonsense, none of which I'm going to reproduce here. I'd quite like you to watch this video, not doze off partway through it. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to thoroughly shred the drivel he came out with, which was borderline fascistic. Basically made out that everyone and their dog who supported George Galloway or is advocating for an end to genocide via protest or peaceful demonstration is tantamount to an enemy of the state now. It struck me as not uncoincidental that he did this the night that the Rochdale by-election results came out, so he could absolutely go on the attack against George Galloway. Galloway is a man with many considerable faults. His views on Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, however, are not amongst them. Galloway won in a constituency with a large Muslim population, but was still some 75% white, and he won mainly because he stood with the people of Palestine, with the people of Gaza, and won on a platform of giving the government and the opposition parties a bloody nose for backing the genocidalists of Israel instead. Sunak is calling peaceful demonstrations on our streets for an end to the violence, to tell our elected representatives that we do not support this. Galloway's election further proof of this, that instead these are intimidating, that these are planning acts of violence even. Sunak said there are Jewish children afraid to wear their uniforms, and said that Muslim women are abused in the streets on the basis of terrorists they have no connection with. That's not the protest doing that. That's you and your government doing that. I don't advocate for anyone being attacked on the street, but it's not coming from these protests. Certainly not the many Muslim and Jewish people who are taking part in them, for a start. People like you and Keir Starmer endanger Muslim people. Knuckle-dragging fools who believe what you say and your loyal media say will associate them with Hamas. You've driven that. You don't differentiate between Hamas and ordinary innocent Palestinians. That the majority of Muslim people are completely innocent, law-abiding citizens. You also allow your own MPs to mouth off about Islamist threats and the likes in our country. Extremists who Sunak brings up himself again in this speech. He literally does it again himself. When this threatens the very people you claim to want to protect, it's just blatant petty racism being weaponized yet again. Trying to paint some Muslims as good devotees of Islam and others as extremists following Islamism. Well, this is a very dangerous muddying of the waters, because people will judge others on what they see, how they dress. You are endangering these people, and based on what? What evidence other than you don't like these protests and you're choosing to blame them? Starmer's just as bad, visiting a Muslim centre at the end of last year and telling people there to release the hostages when they aren't Hamas. Equally, if there are Jewish people being legitimately threatened for their faith, that is wrong and should be dealt with. And the police have the power to do that already. But it is also true to say this issue has been weaponised to death, and the fact you enable that to take down a Labour leader who threatened the status quo, along with his own party who did that, shows this again is a problem establishment politicians created, and now you can't fix it, you can't get that genie back in its bottle. So instead you seek to deflect and blame people marching against Israel, conflating that with Judaism, Jewishness being pro-Israel when it's not, when so many Jewish people are not. They are ardently anti-Zionists themselves, and they condemn what Israel is doing. He complained about people storming council meetings. Well, these are public events, and there are being protests at them, not attacks. MPs protested outside their front doors he now claims is unacceptable, as we saw recently with Tory MP Tobias Ellwood. Yet where was all this condemnation when Jeremy Corbyn was being doorstepped daily? They laughed at that. Where indeed was the condemnation of the attack on George Galloway in 2014, which left him scarred? Somebody who was pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. And that's the reason he wears that hat of his all the time. Seems a good point to move on to Galloway, actually. As Sunak said, it is beyond alarming that he's been elected, saying he dismisses the horror of what happened on October 7th, glorifies Hezbollah, and was endorsed by the BNP. I'm going to come to Galloway's response in the next video I'm making. It absolutely warrants a video all of its own, because it is an absolute masterclass in taking down both politicians and the media alike. So look out for that one later. But to address Sunak's points here, whereas he is still obsessed over what happened on October 7th, Galloway, and frankly most of this country, are more appalled at the 5 months of genocide that's happened since, which you support, and are still supplying arms to carry on. Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government, much as Hamas are Gazan governments. You can call them terrorists, the UK can define them as terrorists, all they like. And as appalling as the optics of someone like Nick Griffin of the BNP supporting Galloway is, equally nobody has any control over who supports you. Both, at the end of the day, have been fringe politicians for a while, therefore anti-establishment politics. Griffin absolutely deserves to stay there and should stay there and doesn't belong anywhere near mainstream politics. But equally, if I was Sunak, I'd be more concerned about the 5,000 or so hard-right members of Britain First who have apparently joined his party. So I'd say look in your own backyard for the far-right first. I'd also point out that you are wibbling to the nation about a man who has actually been elected to his post, whereas you, Sunshine, you got appointed, not even by members of your own party, let alone the general public, just by your fellow Tory MPs. So let's not talk about dangers to democracy when you have absolutely no democratic mandate to be the Prime Minister. Your predecessor was appointed too, the Lettish Truss. That's not democracy either. Your Foreign Secretary got appointed by you, courtesy of giving them a gong in the House of Lords, so you could. Not via election, not elected either. So how is that democracy? You do not get to talk about what is democratic and what is not. You do not know the meaning of the word. Galloway, as I've said, has his faults. He's got a lot of them. But he is more legitimate in his post than Sunak is in his. And as a bonus, he clearly also scares the living daylights out of Sunak. Not for what he stands for, but as an orator, he will rinse every politician that decides to cross parliamentary swords with him, not least hopeless cases on that score like Sunak and Starmer. Sunak wants to protect our democracy, and all of the above is apparently a threat to that. The streets are being hijacked, the rule of law isn't being abided by. Threats of violence and intimidation are happening to the point the PM is stood there at the lectern telling us they must be resisted. He goes on telling us that all of these extremists are painting the West as being solely what is wrong with the world, when right now in Gaza we're enabling that. And actually, without British imperialist interference, the State of Israel, well, it simply wouldn't exist at all to start with. But Sunak says we should reject the accusations of being on the wrong side of history. Newsflash, numbnuts, we very much are. You can reject that. You can disagree all you like. That's your right. But frankly, right now, all we want is a polling booth to reject you, along with everyone else who thinks like you. That's what Galloway proved in Rochdale. That's why you were stood at that podium talking tripe. He did get charitable, though. We are allowed to criticise the government. Well, lucky us. Good, I do, and I will keep on doing so. We can demonstrate, but only for as long as we aren't calling for the eradication of another state. Well, you might want to look at the legal basis for the existence of Israel, because there isn't one, as was revealed in the extensive legalese at the ICJ the other day by the Arab League of Nations presentation, which I covered in another video. But equally, nations come and go all the time. So what makes Israel more special than any of the rest of them? At any rate, his waffle culminated in a new framework, that's the word he was using, to deal with this non-issue. Police being told, we'll support you in policing protests. A veiled message, if ever there was one, that they will be protected despite potentially being allowed to be more heavy-handed, perhaps. Who'd be surprised? A crackdown on universities allowing dissenting views to be platformed at them. And, of course, deportation of the very people he says he wants to protect if they aren't sticking to the right message. His message, obviously. There were no calls per se for new legislation here, though. If any feature in this framework he spoke of, that remains to be seen. New laws have been denied. I'm not convinced so. After all, it is coming from a Tory. However, this fabricated concoction of dissent facing Britain does smack of a manufactured crisis here, especially when he talks of people calling for jihad on our streets, projecting anti-Semitic tropes onto Big Ben. Not true. The phrase from the river to the sea is not anti-Semitic. How can it be when Zionists use it themselves when referring to Israel having that right? It's all very extremist language, we're told. But it isn't us saying it. It's the Prime Minister. In an election year, and as crooked and corrupt as Sunak's government has been, could this supposed danger to the fabric of our society be the first step towards calling off the election entirely? Now, Sunak right now is denying that, so he's been asked. But of course he could come out to that podium again and say, well, things are worsening as our position on all things Israel don't shift. Both the government and their support for the Netanyahu regime and our support for an end to the genocide and a Palestinian state. Who'd put it past our parliamentary Tory party appointed PM, who's never won a vote for his leadership, never won a vote to be PM or even Tory leader, to keep on avoiding that, when he knows he would lose, and seemingly has an opportunity right now in this confected crisis to be able to avoid one. We can't afford to change leader at this dangerous time and all of that. Starmer, as always, is in complete agreement with his statement, and what he said at the podium yesterday, is rancid as it was. So who'd rule out the possibility of a potential government of national unity between them? United in their loyalty to Israel, that would be. Loyalty to the establishment and against all of us and what we actually want from our leaders. A whole now is not the time to change leadership narrative when we have this massive crisis to deal with. You can see it being rolling out now. I can completely see Sunak eventually stalling the election to desperately cling to power. But I can't see all of his own party necessarily agreeing with it. So many of them actually want Sunak gone, as it is. Quite what he gets out of being PM with all the wealth he has, I don't know. Contacts for future business dealings, I suppose, because he can never have enough money. As for a joint government with Labour on this, Starmer is too power hungry, I fancy, to actually share power. He's too much of a control freak within his own party for that, even if they are seemingly always on the same page as the Tories. Fundamentally, there has to be more to this going on, because we know Sunak is just making so much of this up. It can't just be about demos. It can't just be about George Galloway. So what is the bigger issue here? What is he up to? Because nobody is buying what he is selling to our faces here. And I know I'm not the only person thinking this. Rishi Sunak is saying a guy getting elected in Rochdale is bad for democracy despite not having a mandate to literally run the country himself. A guy that is saying people opposing and demonstrating against him is mob rule, despite him and his government aiding and abetting in genocide in the Middle East right now. And that those opposing him could face increased consequences going forward. A guy that wants to deport migrants in violation of human rights legislation. When Sunak is talking about this being a bad day for democracy, and he needs to enact further measures, it's out and out first step on a descent into fascism. It's the language of dictators he's coming out with here. Because our protests, our speaking out against him and what he stands for is working. So how long until people are being literally arrested and imprisoned over this? When what we are doing is proving to be so effective, especially if he gives himself more time to deliver on this. We are a threat to the establishment order when we see what our government and our politicians on both sides of the House are doing, and we are opposed to that. They like things as they are. But when we change our minds on that, clearly we're being seen as the enemy then. Not votes to be won, but a problem to be dealt with. In that vein, we saw George Galloway elected, and this is why he was elected, because he threatens that status quo too. Check out this video recommendation for my take on that, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so George Galloway is given what is frankly a masterclass in how to handle our pathetic media, their quizzling questions, their establishment shilling, and make them really, really uncomfortable as they desperately try to get that gotcha. He's been around the block too many times, he's dealt with them on too many occasions, but he also shows the kind of answers politicians can give if they want to. If they weren't so worried about towing the party line or staying on message and not endangering corporate donations and the like. But equally, the deflection onto his supporters afterwards shows how willing the media are to play Rishi Sunak's game after his manufactured protester crisis speech last night as well. Right, so George Galloway's interview with Sky News' Sam Coates following Rishi Sunak's speech at the podium outside of 10 Downing Street last night, Sunak's weaponization of a racial and democratic crisis in the UK, ended up largely overshadowed as Galloway in no uncertain terms said what he thought of Sunak, and indeed what he thought of mainstream media questioning at the same time. The Galloway interview is getting shared far, far more than Sunak's little turn at the lectern, and there's a very good reason for that. This video is 7 minutes long. It's impossible to edit it down to something shorter than that because, frankly, every second of it is exactly how all politicians should deal with really dishonest questioning. Watch this.
I'm standing here at George Galloway's campaign headquarters. George Galloway, did you just watch the Prime Minister's speech?
I didn't watch it, but I understood the first part of it related to the Rochdale by-election.
The Prime Minister has just said that the election of you to Parliament is beyond horrifying. What do you say to that?
Well, I can understand how disappointed he is about the by-election. The Conservative Party, which is the government of the country, was crushed, not just by me, but by an independent candidate that no one had ever heard of before outside of Rochdale. So it was a disastrous night for the Conservatives and a disastrous night for Labour. I got more votes than Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and the Reform Party put together, which adds up to a pretty crushing rejection of the two-party system. So I understand why he's alarmed.
I want you to address some of the specifics that the Prime Minister said about you this evening. He said that you backed Hezbollah. Is that true?
I don't know what that means, backed Hezbollah. I oppose Israel's occupation of Lebanon, and I respect the right of people in occupied territory to resist their occupier. And I've done so since Hezbollah was formed and Israel occupied much of Lebanon, right up to the Litani River, regularly bombing Beirut and so on. So I'm not sure what business that is of his, because you see,
Hezbollah are a terrorist organisation.
Actually, they're part of the government of Lebanon, a country with which we have sovereign diplomatic relations. I had this debate with Sky's Anna Botting in 2006. It's quite an epic clip. You should watch it. More than 100 million people have. They said all these things about me in the by-election. And in the by-election, it was them that got crushed in the democratic process. So I'm not sure why he would reheat it now.
The Prime Minister is saying
talk
that
as
you
if
are...
this is God. We're talking about little Rishi Sunak in the fag end of his prime ministership. Don't talk to me as if he's come down from the mount with tablets of stone. The things that he says are somehow meant to awe me. They may awe you, they don't awe me.
A lot of people have just watched what the Prime Minister said. This is your opportunity to respond to what he said. Well, he says that there are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. He is implying you are a divisive figure. You have run an election campaign that has tried to appeal, particularly, and not entirely, to one section of the community.
Who won the election? Me or Rishi Sunak? I've got the democratic mandate here, not Rishi Sunak. He didn't even come second. He was lucky to come third. So don't put to me statements made by Rishi Sunak as if I'm supposed to be impressed by them. He don't impress me much.
We at Sky have spent some time today on the streets of Rochdale, and there are people who say that they feel intimidated by people like you and the people that have supported you.
I have just
and they have pointed out that you have concentrated your campaign on foreign affairs, and they worry that Rochdale will not be the winner.
That's my answer to you. I was just elected with a thumping majority by the electorate in Rochdale. That's all that matters to me.
So why are there people in the streets of Rochdale today worried?
Well, people voted yesterday, and they voted for me. Why is that difficult for you to grasp?
Why are there people on the streets worried?
There may be people who didn't vote for me who are worried, but the majority, the thumping majority, voted for me. I've got the mandate, and I'm going to the House of Commons with it.
And it's a mandate, you think, to do what? Because there are people that listen to what you say about whether or not Israel has a right to exist, what you say about what many Jewish people think are threatening slogans.
We had this conversation last night. Why are you reheating it?
Because in the light of the Prime Minister's statement...
Don't keep telling me about the Prime Minister as if he was Moses.
Do you not respect the Prime Minister?
Do I respect the Prime Minister? I despise the Prime Minister. And guess what? Guess what? Millions and millions and millions of people in this country despise the Prime Minister. I don't respect the Prime Minister at all.
What are you planning to do next week when you arrive in Parliament?
Well, I'm meeting the Speaker on Monday morning, and then I'll be introduced and sworn in. I'll be escorted by the Right Honourable David Davis MP, former Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. I don't know why he would do that if he thought I was the kind of man you're clearly implying that I am. David Davis is one of the great parliamentarians of today and this age. And I'll be taking my seat in the House of Commons and speaking for the people of Rochdale. That's what I was elected to do.
And what is your message also to Keir Starmer?
My message to Keir Starmer is that the skids are under you in scores of Labour seats up and down the country, because you've lost the trust, you've lost the confidence of millions of your traditional loyal voters.
Now, we have now had an election where two of the candidates have alleged intimidation. The Prime Minister referenced that intimidation in his address on the steps of...
to the Prime Minister as if that's supposed to impress me. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister is a rather diminutive, diminished and degraded politician. He made a party political statement. I don't care about Rishi Sunak's attitude. What I care about is that the returning officer, a man of unimpeachable integrity, I'm sure you'll agree, declared it a free and fair election, and me as the winner, and Rishi Sunak as one of the crushed two big parties in the state.
So why are two candidates?
Keep repeating the same questions to me, because I have other people to talk to. So let's make this the last one, shall we?
We got a party to deal with.
Allegations of intimidation, allegations that your supporters intimidated other candidates.
Five times you've said that. The returning officer declared it last night. You were there as a free and fair election, and me as the winner.
And the Electoral Commission today have said that they're going to look and talk to the parties.
You have to just suck it up. I won the election.
Sunak is not Moses. I do hope Sam Coates has got that message now. Indeed, it's a perfectly reasonable point to ask in light of the Tories getting rinsed in Rochdale as much as every other mainstream party did. Why Galloway or anyone else who doesn't vote Tory or doesn't support the Tories should care about what Sunak says or does or thinks. I'll never vote for Sunak. I don't care what he has to say beyond how it affects us in our daily lives, as the unelected Prime Minister made that chilling speech that Coates alluded to, which, yes, spoke about how horrifying Sunak found the prospect of Galloway being elected, but used that as part of a very sinister speech to set out what might well be an extremely disturbing agenda of clampdowns on freedom of speech, of expression, of our right to protest, and in which some people are talking about Sunak possibly setting all this up to avoid a general election that he would be certain to lose. Well, he'd have to put up with George Galloway a bit longer if he did that, though, wouldn't he? But although the interview started with that, at no point did Coates ask Galloway about his plans for Rochdale, congratulate him, to ask him what he feels were the reasons he won. Because, of course, all of that would legitimise him. And the narrative from Sunak, which Coates seemed to obsessively hang on to, would have been harmed. We must treat him as a dissident, ostracise him, isolate him, treat him as some kind of terrorist sympathiser from within, for no other reason than he is opposed to what the establishment parties are in their loyalty to Israel and against those fighting them. So that is exactly where Sam Coates' line of questioning ended up going. But Galloway was prepared for it, frankly handed Coates' backside on a silver platter. You don't have to like Galloway to appreciate what he did in that interview. Coates brought up Hezbollah as terrorists, for instance, and that Galloway backed them. He brushed off that notion, reminding Coates they are part of the Lebanese government. And despite that, we still have diplomatic ties with that country, as indeed Hamas are government in Gaza, and reminded Coates again that Israel have attacked and invaded Lebanon, just as they've done with Gaza here, which is why Hezbollah exist, similar vein to why Hamas exist. Familiar pattern of Coates quoting Sunak in a question started to build by this point. Third question, third time he mentions Sunak. So Galloway ridicules him for it, and why not? Do you not have a relevant question to ask? Bear in mind, Galloway had already said that at that point he hadn't seen the speech Sunak had given. Coates knew that and still told Galloway, well, this is your opportunity to respond to what he said. Well, ridiculing Coates seemed to be the best way to go on at that point, surely, and Sunak whilst he was at it. Coates tried shifting tack again, saying Sunak was talking about division in society and that Galloway was one such divisive figure, and then chose to talk about allegations of people in Rochdale being fearful of Galloway being their MP. Which, sure, there might be some. The sort of people who listen to Sam Coates and think what Sunak says is equivalent to the Sermon on the Mount as Galloway chided him. But equally, we had a Labour Party that was literally trying to rig votes in one ballot station on the night of the election, resulting in the returning officer sacking one of the clerks there. Sunak can talk about all this nonsense of fear-mongering, but he himself is guilty of that, as are other Tory MPs, from Robert Jenrick to Suella Braverman to Lee Anderson, stoking up hate and Islamophobia whilst they're at it. But equally, Galloway could snap back and ask who won the election, because he did, emphatically. As he said at the start of the interview, he got more votes than the Tories, Labour, the Lib Dems and Reform UK got combined. The entire establishment party spectrum. That doesn't show a populace in fear of Galloway when they voted for him. But such is the dishonesty of the line of questioning. When Coates asked him what he plans to do next week in Parliament, finally a non-Sunak related question, Galloway gave a perfectly straight and sensible answer to him. If you ask a decent question, you'll get a proper answer. Making reference to the fact he was being presented to Parliament by a Tory MP, and put to Coates why he would do that if he thought Galloway was the sort of man Coates had been trying to imply that he was. What will bother Keir Starmer is that throughout that 7-minute interview, the only round of applause that came from those assembling around Coates, people Coates apparently felt threatened by afterwards, despite being mainly a group of women as it was when Galloway said the skids were under Starmer as he'd lost the trust in scores of Labour seats, which we are seeing as more and more independent candidates are standing to oppose Labour MPs, failing to stand up for their constituents and failing to oppose this genocide. Coates got more exasperated as the interview went on, more desperate. He brought up allegations of intimidation, but at the end of the day, Exactly as Galloway said, the returning officer declared it a fair election, and he won. What Sandcoats did is what we've come to expect from the mainstream media. He gave a perfect example of it. What Galloway did was anything the response to such questioning we're used to hearing, and giving responses that they deserve to get. He fought fire with fire, and when Galloway goes to Parliament next week, expect Sunak and Starmer to get such treatment directly to their faces too, with Sunak having painted a rather large target on himself to be the first for Galloway to deal with. Not only for the dangerous talk he came out with in his speech, but also attacks on Galloway that he didn't have the courage to say to his face. He'll get the chance now. But Sunak's speech yesterday wasn't the only troublesome and concerning news coming from number 10 in the last week, as Sunak has hinted at things that could possibly amount to a police state, no less. I covered that story in this video here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.